It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Robert Darnton. Throughout his distinguished career, Professor Darnton has been educating and illuminating the world as one of the preeminent experts of Enlightenment France. The son of a New York Times World War II war correspondent, Professor Darnton graduated from Harvard before completing his PhD in history as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. After a brief stint following in his father's footsteps as a reporter with the New York Times, Professor Darnton served with the Society of Fellows at Harvard before embarking on a nearly 4-decade career as professor at Princeton University. His accomplishments and accolades over the years are innumerable and include a MacArthur Prize Fellowship, a National Book Critics Circle Award, and the National Humanities Medal. He has been called a celebrated historian, a digital library pioneer, and a champion of books, and is regarded as one of the world's foremost authorities on the French Enlightenment. In 2007, he returned to Harvard to become the Carl H. Pforzheimer University Professor and Director of the University Library at Harvard, a position he held until his retirement last summer. When he isn't immersed in 18th century France, Professor Darnton plays an integral role in preserving the knowledge of today. He is a leading advocate for open access publishing and helps spearhead projects that include the Digital Public Library of America. The fact that I spend a lot of time in the 18th century doesn't mean I'm not concerned with the 21st, he said in an interview in 2007. Through his work, Professor Darnton has provided us a glimpse of centuries past, and his continued efforts ensure the knowledge of today will thrive for centuries to come. Please join me in welcoming Professor Darnton.
Thank you for that kind invitation. Thank all of you for staying here. You must feel a little bit of colloque fatigue, but it's been a wonderful colloquium. I've learned a lot myself, had a good time, and I would like to congratulate McGill on the J. Patrick Lee collection. It's quite spectacular. So this is a happy moment. What I would like to do would be to discuss Voltaire and the pirates. Concentrating perhaps a little more on the pirates than on Voltaire, but you'll see how they link up. The word actually is not accidental. Pirates, buccaneers, bandits, those are all quotations from the manuscript correspondence of publishers and booksellers from the 18th century. This correspondence explodes from time to time in expletives, which contrast strongly with the normal business-like tone of the letters. And the pirates themselves are stranger still. So I would like to introduce you to one of them, Frédéric Samuel Osterwald, the principal director of the Société Typographique de Neuchâtel, the source of most of my remarks. A string of dignities followed Osterwald's name wherever it appears in the local context of Neuchâtel, a tiny Prussian principality in French Switzerland. Banneret, that's the honorific head of the city militia. Former maître bourgeois en chef, that's a glorious title in Neuchâtel in the 18th century. The chief executive, in fact, of the town council. He was a former director of the local college, a man of letters, and secretary of something called the Société du Jardin, which is where the cream of the cream in this little principality gathered. It was a kind of literary club. He lived in a handsome town house near the lake. He made wine from his own vineyard. He drove about in a carriage. He came from one of the richest and most respectable families in the town or in the whole canton. In 1780, at the height of the STNs, that's Société Typographique de Neuchâtel, at the height of its activities, Oosterwal was a grandfather, aged 67. He had a dignified bearing and a flair for oratory that earned him the nickname of Golden-Tongued in the town council. He devoted his rhetoric during his tenure as maître bourgeois en chef to the defense of, I'm quoting his manuscripts now, the rights, exemptions, and privileges, end quote, of the bourgeoisie, according to a manual on local politics that he wrote for the big shots in Neuchâtel. Now, I submit to you, this was an unlikely pirate, this bon bourgeois who defended privileges at home and attacked them abroad because he built his business on publishing cheap, unauthorized reprints, usually called pirated editions or contrefaçons, editions of books that appeared with a royal privilege in France. There were dozens of people like Oosterwal, like the Société Typographique, surrounding France. As most of you know, most of the Enlightenment was published in those houses, but they also published a tremendous amount of pirated books. So I think of France as surrounded by a fertile crescent of publishing houses. The only one whose papers have survived is the STN, hence its importance, but they are magnificent papers, a historian's dream, 50,000 letters and all kinds of account books. Well, these publishing houses around France obviously varied according to the personalities of the people who led them and the circumstances in which they were located, but none of these pirates had the slightest resemblance to Jean Bart or Captain Kidd. The paradoxical nature of piracy derives from the nature of the book trade in early modern Europe, and it suggests the need to reconsider the history of intellectual property. Copyright, as we know it, did not exist in the 18th century, except in England, the Statute of Anne 1710. Throughout France and Germany, property in texts derived from privileges bestowed by princes. It had nothing to do with the creative genius of authors, despite the claims of Diderot and Lessing. According to a fundamental edict issued by Louis XVI on August 30th, 1777, I'm quoting now, privilege in the book trade is a grace founded in justice, end quote. Far from accepting the claims of publishers who had lobbied hard in the Direction de la Librairie and had recruited Diderot to their side to stake their case, actually, the king refused, and I'm quoting again from the legislation, to convert the enjoyment of a grace into a property in law, end quote. Now, this archaic language turns up everywhere in official documents. The Book Trade Administration, the Direction de la Librairie, was built around a division called La Librairie Gracieuse, and the privileges printed in every legal book took the form of an edict by the king, which always ended with the phrase, car tel est notre plaisir. This is a different world from the world of copyright. But of course, the grace and pleasure of the king of France had no legal force in the little Swiss principality of Neuchâtel and Valangin, whose sovereign since 1707 was Frederick II. Frederick couldn't care less about what the Swiss printed, and he applauded a lot of the philosophical literature that came out of the Swiss presses. So Oosterwal was free to publish whatever he pleased. provided that it didn't horrify the local authorities. So from the perspective of most people at the time, and from his own, he was not a pirate, but a pillar of society. Now, the legal complexities were compounded by a clash of economic interests. In France, a fundamental conflict had opened up in the 17th century between the big Parisian publishers and the leading booksellers in the provinces. Colbert had attempted to resolve this conflict in a typically Colbertiste fashion by giving the Parisian Guild an effective monopoly of privileges and also the power, the police power, to enforce that monopoly. Driven from the heart of the legal book businesses, the provincials fell back on cheap reprints supplied by foreign publishers, along with spicy assortments of forbidden literature. The forbidden ingredient in the trade is familiar to historians because, of course, it did convey most of the Enlightenment. In fact, however, the bulk of the shipments from foreign suppliers to provincial book dealers consisted of contrefaçons. So I would like to, excuse me, it's business history. I know we should be talking more about philosophy, but business history turns out, I find, to be surprisingly fascinating. So I would go so far, in fact, as to argue that by 1770, most of the current books circulating in France, aside from chapbooks and devotional tracts and professional manuals, came from the pirate publishers that were located outside the kingdom, as well as from some located inside, especially in Lyon and Rouen. The boom in piracy reached such proportions that it was acknowledged, actually, in this key edict of 1777. So I'd like to quote the legislation so you get some of the flavor. Quote, "And as the king has been informed that there exists a great number of books that were pirated, contrefait, before the present edict, and that the fortune of a great many provincial booksellers consists in these books, since they have no other means to meet their obligations, His Majesty has judged that as an expression of his kindness, he will excuse the owners of these reprints, contrefaçons, from the rigors of punishment required by the law," end quote. Now, this is an extraordinary thing to say in a royal edict. It permitted the book dealers to sell off their stock of pirated works, provided that they had each book stamped by a syndic of their local guild. This extraordinary measure legalized in one fell swoop a vast amount of literature, while threatening henceforth to be extra strict in confiscating future contrefaçons. Its purpose, it declared, was, quote, "to end the rivalry that divides the book trade of Paris from that of the provinces," end quote, by readjusting conditions in favor of the provincials. It never succeeded. That's a long story, which I think needs further research, but it reveals a great deal about the economic and the legal conditions of publishing under the Ancien Régime. The archives of the STN make it possible to study those conditions in detail because pirating differed from normal publishing in a crucial aspect. When a publisher put out a new book, he took a shot in the dark, hoping that it would sell. When a pirate reprinted a book with a sales record, he could take aim with some accuracy, calculating demand according to reports from booksellers and sales reps. Pirates conducted market research. Anachronistic as it sounds, it corresponds to their actual practice. Therefore, by reconstructing their calculations, following the flow of information they received, and by observing them closely at work, one can study the literary marketplace up close. Oosterwald and his main partner, Abraham Bosset de Luz, ran their business according to what Bosset described as, I'm quoting, calculation, a demonstrative science, end quote. Piracy, as they practiced it, was indeed a science, an applied science, the kind of thing that goes on in business schools today. Whether pirates or not, 18th century publishers received most of their information through the mail. Their correspondence, as one of them put it, was, quote, the soul of our commerce, end quote. By following orders as they arrived in letters from booksellers everywhere in France and in French-reading Europe, the STN kept track of demand. Their customers often sent remarks about which books, authors, and genre were selling best in their localities. Some even suggested books to pirate and promised to make advanced orders for a certain number of copies if the STN would follow their advice. For example, Antoine Paris Duluc, one of the most important booksellers in Lyon, proposed, I quote, a special arrangement whereby we will purchase a large number of books that we advise you to print owing to their sales in France, end quote. So they're doing deals. They're very conscious about this. Of course, a book recommended in Bordeaux could be a flop in Lille, and the STN received actually so much mail, as I say, 50,000 letters during the 20 years before the French Revolution, that it's rather difficult to get a clear view of general tendencies. Certain dossiers, however, are particularly revealing because they contain a regular dialogue between the publisher and a bookseller who was so well informed and so trustworthy that his counsel proved to be crucial in the publication process. So there's a real dialogue that's going on all the time, and I'd like to reconstruct a little bit of it for you. To print or not to print, that was the question every publisher had to answer. By seeing how the STN answered it through consultations with a veteran bookseller, one can understand some of the logic behind publishing in general during the 18th century. Pierre Gosse Jr. of the firm Gosse et Pinet in The Hague knew the market for French books as well as any dealer inside or outside France. After 30 years of business with all the major publishing houses, he was an ideal ally for the STN, and it relied heavily on his advice during the first years of its existence when it was learning its way around the book trade. Gosse sent the STN orders as well as counsel, and in return, it furnished him with books at a reduced price and with an exclusive arrangement for their sale in his region, provided that he bought enough copies. As an example of the deferential tone on Oosterwald's side of the correspondence, here is one of his typical requests for advice. So I'll quote it so you get the tone, because these are quite dignified pirates. Quote, "The agreeable obligation we have assumed with your permission, monsieur, to inform you not only of what we are doing, but also of the projects that we are considering, and the high regard we have of your wise counsel, emboldens us to bring to your notice the recent publication in Paris of an interesting work that is said to be very good, a treatise on wool-bearing animals. 1 volume in quarto with illustrations. Considering on the one hand the general utility of such a book, and on the other that the high price of the Paris edition puts it far beyond the purchasing power of all but a small number of persons, we would be inclined to reprint it right away in an octavo or duodecimo format and without illustrations, since they are hardly necessary for things that everyone sees every day, wool-bearing animals." caterpillars is what he's talking about. But since we do not undertake anything without first asking your opinion, monsieur, we pray you to tell us how much of the edition you would be inclined to take, end quote. Now, the commercial calculation can be distinguished easily behind the flowery language. Osterwald was not proposing a great work of literature by a Voltaire or a Rousseau, but rather a quite ordinary and practical sort of book, the kind that seemed likely to sell in a particular sector of the public and that would be relatively cheap, thanks to its small format and its lack of illustrations. Pirates often undersold original editions by eliminating what they called typographical luxury. And they minimized risks by persuading favorite clients to make large advance orders at special discounts. Goss, one of the biggest wholesale and retail dealers in the Low Countries, in fact in all of Europe, sometimes ordered 100, 500, even 1,000 copies at a time. He had purchased 3/4 of the Encyclopédie d'Yverdon, the encyclopédie that Fortuné Barthélemy de Félix was printing in Yverdon at the other side of the Lake of Neuchâtel at a press run of 2,500 copies. But Goss had no interest in the treatise on wool-bearing animals. Quote, "We don't believe that by its nature it will sell very well," end quote. So I'm going to quote his letters quite a lot for you to get the flavor of the strictly commercial way these people talk about literature. Quote, "And to tell you the truth, we cannot advise you to reprint it. We doubt that you will make anything from it," end quote. However, he was tempted by another book that Osterwald proposed at the same time. Quote, "We are delighted to hear that you are about to get an advance copy of the History of Charles V. That's by William Robertson, translated by Suard. It will certainly be an excellent enterprise," end quote. And the dialogue jumped in this way from one kind of book to another, because it covered the entire spectrum of the literature that was being published in French. In a series of letters sent to Goss in March 1770, Osterwald requested advice about 7 books that the STN was considering at that time. A popular scientific manual on inoculation, a translation of Sermons for Young Women, was not Écraser la femme, but by James Fordyce, A History of Spanish Poetry, by Louis Joseph Velasquez, a treatise on jurisprudence, Le Droit des Gens by Émeric de Vatel, and 2 literary anthologies. Goss considered them one after the other and delivered his verdicts in a blunt, businesslike manner. He would not order any more books about inoculation. The market was saturated with them. Fordyce's sermon struck him as a, quote, good seller, so he sent an advanced order for 250 copies. He refused to consider the book about Spanish poetry because he had never heard of it and never bought a pig in a poke, as he said, chat en poche. Vatel's treatise, though excellent, did not suit him for reasons peculiar to the Dutch trade. Quote, "Since the booksellers of Leiden, by printing the first edition, have acquired what we here call the right of copy, droit de copie, and not the privilege, and since we in the Dutch book trade religiously respect this right of copy among ourselves, I cannot sell it in this country," end quote. Evidently, the Dutch occupied a position closer to the English than to the French in the spectrum that extended from the traditional notion of privilege to the modern concept of copyright. And as to the other 2 anthologies, Goss advised against them. Quote, "A pretty 10-volume edition in small duodecimo of the best moral tales in verse and prose has just been published in Liège. 2 editions of this work would be too many. Therefore, monsieur, we advise you to renounce yours. Several anthologies of plays have been published in these parts, and none has sold well. So we cannot advise you to undertake this enterprise either. You certainly can employ your presses better on something else, end quote. Well, Gosse's letters, I'm abridging, contained so much crucial information that they really did determine Oosterwald's publishing decisions. The STN abandoned all of the projects it had mentioned, except Fordyce's sermons, which it decided to pirate because Gosse's endorsement and his advance order of 250 copies tipped the balance. Meanwhile, Oosterwald continued to fire off requests for more professional counseling. What would Gosse say to a dictionary of animals? No, was the answer. We strongly advise you against this enterprise. A description of Swiss glaciers? No. It was an interesting work, but it wasn't selling well. A refutation of D'Holbach's notorious System of Nature by Jean de Castillon. Gosse had imported the Berlin edition, which had sold badly, and he did not want any more because, quote, we judge according to our sales, end quote. Furthermore, quote, the people who buy those kinds of books couldn't care less about refutations, end quote. Bougainville's voyage around the world. Gosse promised it, quote, a very good and excellent enterprise, but he would commit himself to an advance order of only 50 copies because, quote, the book trade is doing so badly everywhere these days. A history of Field Marshal Saxe and a supplement to the Roman Comique, or Life of Jean Monnet, director of acting troupes. No, and no again. Quote, these are books that nowadays sell only for a short time after their first publication. We don't want to fill our stock rooms with them, end quote. Now, it may seem that Gosse was a crusty, congenital naysayer, but he speculated heavily on books he thought would sell. The difficulty existed on Oosterwald's side of the dialogue. When he founded the STN in 1769, Oosterwald had enough experience as a writer and a reader to know his way around the Republic of Letters, but he knew little about publishing. He admitted as much in a letter written after his first 18 months at the head of the STN, quote, perhaps we are still only apprentices, end quote. It took years of practice to master the book trade. Gosse, one of the most respected masters in Europe, spoke about the trade in a strictly commercial manner. Quote, today, monsieur, it is absolutely necessary to conform to current taste, to the taste of the public in one's business. Men of learning often get that wrong. A bookseller with a large trade is far better than a scholar at assessing the public's taste, end quote. Speaking as a scholar, I take that very seriously. In addition to the difficulties of learning to estimate demand, the STN also had to solve production problems. During the first 2 years of its operations, it lacked adequate fonts of type, a well-disciplined workforce, and an effective foreman in its printing shop. Its directors had not yet learned to defend themselves against the endless tricks of the paper suppliers, nor had they mastered the craft of French-style book design. And worst of all, they did not yet know how to coordinate all their activities in such a way as to get their books to their customers on time. That is, before the publication of other editions put out by other pirates. Time was the most important factor in the printing business, time and information. In a world without effective copyright, there was an open war on any book that promised to sell. especially in France. Pirates raced to the French market with reprints turned out from printing shops at strategic locations around France's borders. The unconstrained competition meant that bestsellers had sales patterns that differed fundamentally from those today. Unlike current blockbusters, that is, books sold in huge quantities by a single publisher, bestsellers in the 18th century existed in many editions produced simultaneously by many publishing houses. The editions were usually small, around 1,000 copies, because no publisher would risk his capital on a large edition of a work that might sit unsold in his warehouse if others beat him to the market. Even original editions, published with a privilege, rarely ran to more than 1,500 copies, in part because paper accounted for about 50% of production costs at a press run of 1,000, and it took up an increasingly expensive proportion of the costs at a larger run, while the cost of composition remained constant. Better to reset the type for a new edition than to spend too much on paper that could not be converted rapidly into sales. More important, the pirates were so quick off the mark thanks to secret informers and proofs filched by workers in their pay that they sometimes beat the original publisher to the market. And they were likely to damage his profits long before he could sell off his first edition. They easily undercut him because they paid nothing for the manuscript and used relatively cheap paper. Sometimes they followed the original closely, producing true contrefaçon or counterfeit copies, but more often they aimed their product at a broader public by eliminating illustrations, abridging the text, and purging the edition of everything that smacked of luxe typographique. I mean, the sense of respect for a text simply doesn't exist among these people. If they went far enough down market, they might not harm the original edition at all. First editions often were produced for a sophisticated elite, pirated editions for the grand public, that is, the beginnings of what would emerge in the 19th century as a mass readership. But the division of labor was not clear enough for both kinds of publishers, those publishing for the elite and those for the general public, to live in peace. In fact, the only thing that held the pirates back in their raids on the French market was the competition among themselves, for they undercut one another as fiercely as they slashed into the profits of the privileged members of the Parisian Guild. They therefore needed to know not only what new books were about to appear, but also what other pirates planned to print them. They often bluffed, announcing editions that they did not really intend to produce in order to scare off the competition or to force their competitors into special deals. They would promise to refrain from publishing a book if the other pirate would sell them a proportion of his edition at a bargain price. Their correspondence is full of negotiations for non-aggression pacts and secret reports about each other's activities. Sometimes they hired agents in Paris and spies in foreign printing shops in order to keep informed about the plots that were always brewing. But with adequate information and good enough timing, the pirates could make a killing. Thanks to their cutthroat tactics and cut-rate books, they provided the most dynamic element in the French book trade. Now, the best way to understand how all these factors work together, and sometimes fail to work, in the actual practice of piracy, is to follow the ups and downs of a single speculation. I would therefore like to sketch the publishing history of the STN's edition of Voltaire's Questions sur l'Encyclopédie as it appears in the correspondence between Oosterwal and Gosse, this major bookseller in The Hague. The Questions, as we've already mentioned several times, was Voltaire's last great work and the biggest enterprise, 9 volumes in octavo, attempted by the STN in its first years. When he first announced it to Gosse in March 1770, Oosterwal indicated that he planned to put out an original edition printed from the manuscripts to be furnished by Voltaire himself. Dazzled by this news, Gosse replied with a letter that, unlike the others that I've been citing, fairly quivered with enthusiasm. So here's an 18th century book dealer contemplating the prospect of a surefire bestseller. Quote, "From your letter, we have seen with surprise that Voltaire at 70 is laboring on a major work with incredible speed and application, that it is to be a new encyclopédie in his manner, which will correct the one that exists and will include everything that the author knows and thinks. You ask, Monsieur, what I think of such an enterprise? I have the honor to answer that it is an enterprise of solid gold, and that never in its existence will the STN come across another nearly as good or better. Furthermore, I will tell you right away that we commit ourselves to taking a large number. Certainly, monsieur, as you say, this work will contain all kinds of things that are new, curious, and extraordinarily powerful. And it will be snapped up at any price as soon as it appears. There are prohibitions to be feared, and one will not be able to sell the book openly, but that will only make it sell faster and better. The STN is sure to make a great coup," end quote. So Voltaire sells, and he fits into the commercial calculations of these very important dealers in the book trade. This book obviously did not belong to the same category as treatises on woolly animals. But the race to make a fortune from it turned out to be far less straightforward than Gosse had anticipated. He soon learned that Oosterwal was not proposing an original edition, but a pirated version of the original that Gabriel Cramer, Voltaire's main publisher, was producing in Geneva. Hoping to snare Gosse's business before Cramer got to him, Oosterwal had avoided any reference to the Genevan side of the affair when he first dangled it in front of Gosse. But he was not entirely disingenuous. Early in March 1770, he had gone to Ferney in search of copy. Voltaire was happy to oblige because by then he no longer cared about making money from his pen. After more than 50 years of experience with publishers, he knew every trick in their trade. And he also had learned to put the tricks to use for a higher cause, the diffusion of enlightenment, the campaign to écraser l'infâme. He therefore agreed to supply Oosterwal with a copy of Cramer's proofs, corrected and expanded, provided that everything took place behind Cramer's back. Voltaire was happy, that is, to pirate himself. It was a way to multiply copies. Besides, he knew that the Questions would be pirated anyway, strange as it sounds to apply such a term to an illegal book. By cooperating with the STN, he could control that process while touching up the text with additional audacities that he could also disavow. And to top it all, he had proposed that the STN publish an expanded edition of his complete works in 40 octavo volumes. The details of this arrangement transpired only little by little in Oosterwald's letters to Gosse. At first, Oosterwald emphasized the need for advice about the new edition of the works, the complete works of Voltaire. Quote, everything that has appeared will be gone over. Scattered pieces will be gathered together. A great many others that have not yet been published will be taken from the portfolio of the author who wants to make this collection complete. You are absolutely right, monsieur, to be surprised that a man of letters at the age of 77 can still work 12 hours and more each day in his bed with a concentration, a presence of mind, and a tone of admirable gaiety, writing, chatting, and dictating all at the same time, surrounded by books and papers. It goes beyond the powers of ordinary mortals, and one has to have seen it to believe it, end quote. So there's testimony about Voltaire at work in his old age, producing not just these petits pâtés and pamphlets we talked about, but a 9-volume work. If such sights could quicken the pulse of a publisher, they did not inspire much enthusiasm on the part of the bookseller. Gosse had already come across so many editions of Voltaire's supposedly complete works that the prospect of another one made him groan. Quote, when will it ever end? Cramer's quarto edition still is not finished, and François Grasset is already at work on a new octavo edition in Lausanne. For my part, I think you must begin by the work you mentioned, the Questions sur l'Encyclopédie. Take everything he wants to give you for a new edition of all his works, but be prudent and don't begin that edition until after his death. Then, having no even more complete editions to fear, you will pull off the best enterprise ever undertaken in the book trade, and most certainly we will then be able to buy a very large number from you, end quote. Booksellers often distrusted Voltaire because by modifying his texts and multiplying the editions, he alienated their customers. No one wanted to pay good money for a slightly new version of a book that one had already bought. By 1770, the entire book trade was waiting impatiently for the death of the great man. The man who had caused so much grief by tinkering over his texts. But he kept them waiting for another 8 years, tinkering till the end. Oosterwald accepted Gosse's advice and concentrated on producing the Questions sur l'Encyclopédie. The next question that he sent to The Hague was, how many copies would Gosse order in advance? 500, came the reply. Only 500? That's a huge amount, by the way, in the book trade of the 18th century. Oosterwald sounded disappointed, but he entered the order immediately in a ledger called the Livre des Commissions and announced in August that he soon expected to receive the first volume, quote, corrected by the author, end quote. The Estienne's edition would appear on the heels of Cramer's and would be, I'm quoting again, far superior to it. As evidence of the Estienne's ability to be quick off the mark, Oosterwald announced that he had just received the 2 sheets of proof for the essay in the Question on God. Quote, the subject is very well treated with wisdom, force, and entirely in the tone that this famous man knows how to give to everything he writes. Starting tomorrow, these 2 sheets will be in press, and you will get some of the first copies. It will serve as a sample of the paper and the type in our edition, and it can be sold separately as a pamphlet. Although that might sound good to a less experienced customer, Oosterwald's sales talk revealed a crucial fact to Gosse. The Estienne was publishing a pirated edition. Gosse shot back an indignant reply, quote, "We were firmly persuaded that you would print this work from the manuscript. Things now are completely different. Grammaire will get to the market first. It is absolutely crucial that you rush everything so that your edition arrives soon after his. If you fail to do so, it will be like serving the mustard after the dinner," end quote. Nevertheless, Gosse did not cancel his order, perhaps because the Neuchâtel edition cost much less than the Genevan. 1 sou per sheet, or 23 sous 6 deniers for volume 1, as opposed to 35 sous charged by Grammaire. Osterwelle sent a reassuring answer. The STN could print as fast as Grammaire, and, quote, "Our edition will have this advantage over the one from Geneva. It will be reviewed, corrected, and augmented by the author, who has made fairly extensive changes on our copy," end quote. It's like the Freiburg edition of the Dictionnaire philosophique, which we were discussing earlier. It's almost the same language. Moreover, Grammaire was said to have sold his entire edition to distributors in Paris, and, quote, "What is one edition more or less of a work of this kind from the pen of the most famous writer of our century," end quote. Meanwhile, Osterwelle turned to problems on the production side of the enterprise. The Question was one of the first ambitious books undertaken by the printing shop in Neuchâtel, and the flow of work soon got caught in snags. Paper did not arrive on time. Workers quit in order to take jobs with better conditions in Lausanne and Geneva. And the foreman failed to coordinate operations effectively. When at last, after 13 weeks of hard labor, the STN completed Volume 1, it ran into difficulties with its distribution system. It shipped off Gosse's 500 copies in 2 large bales on December 9, 1770, instructing its agent in Basel, Luc Preiswerk, to forward them down the Rhine. Despite its expensive tolls, the Rhine offered an excellent route to The Hague. But Gosse's books had not reached Gosse 6 weeks later, when volumes 1 through 3 of Grammaire's edition were already being sold in the shops of other Dutch dealers. Gosse was furious. He thought he'd been had, and as to the pamphlet version of God, it left him unimpressed. Quote, "As this brochure contains only 2 sheets, it will soon be pirated by some young booksellers in this country," end quote. Thus, pirating took place at several levels. Beneath the large enterprises sold on an international scale, smaller works were pirated by smaller publishers for local markets. There were contrefaçons of contrefaçons. Now, it may seem misleading to speak of a pirated or counterfeit edition in the case of the Question, because Grammaire did not purchase the text from Voltaire, and he possessed no legal right to reproduce it. In fact, the consistory of Geneva would censor him for the book's impieties in March 1772, while Voltaire dismissed the pirating with witticisms such as this burlesque edict issued from Ferney, quote, "It is hereby permitted to any bookseller to print my silliness, be it true or false, at his risk, peril, and profit," end quote. So Voltaire's making fun of the whole business. Yet he felt morally committed to his publisher, Grammaire, and refused to offend him by collaborating openly with the pirates. He even urged Grammaire to fight back against them. Quote, "You won't be pirated if you take the right measures, and you could put a notice in volume 2 that will discredit the pirated editions," end quote. In fact, Grammaire knew very well that his Question would be pirated. He merely sought to cream off the demand with a first edition by beating the pirates to the market. That is why the delay in the STN's shipments aroused such fury by Gosse. Oosterwal fended off Gosse's complaints with various excuses, while complaining with equal vehemence to Preiswerk, the shipping agent, for delays in the shipping, because the bales with Volume 1 still had not arrived in The Hague by the beginning of March, nearly 3 months after their departure from Neuchâtel. By then, at least, the printing shop was functioning well, and Oosterwal began to speak of his pirating with a certain pride. Quote, "We are firmly resolved, on the one hand, to make our reprints the equal as far as possible as of the originals in format, paper, and character, and on the other, to organize our operations in such a way that our books will always be finished at the prescribed and agreed time, something that frequent desertions of workers occasionally prevented us from happening in previous times," end quote. In the spring of 1771, thanks to new arrangements with shipping agents, boatsmen, and wagoners, the shipments went better, not only down the Rhine, but also over the Jura Mountains to Lyon, where Veuve Réguillat received 500 copies of the first 3 volumes in June. But as soon as the distribution problems were solved, a new snafu appeared on the production side. The copy stopped arriving. In order to fight back against the pirates who threatened to attack him from Lausanne, Amsterdam, and Berlin, as well as from Neuchâtel, Kramer decided to release several volumes at once, thereby gaining time to market his edition while his competitors were printing theirs. He therefore held back volumes 1 and 2 until he had finished volume 3, and then sent them all at once to his customers, wholesale or retail booksellers, who were able to offer them for sale long before the STN's volumes reached Gosse. This tactic actually threatened the other pirates more than the STN, because the STN drew its copy directly from Ferney in the form of duplicate proofs. Oosterwal had been introduced into the household of Voltaire and Ferney by Élie Bertrand, a confidant of Voltaire and an uncle of Jean-Élie Bertrand, Oosterwal's son-in-law, who was also a co-director of the STN. So family relations and friendships played a crucial part in the functioning of the supply line, especially at its source, because everyone close to Voltaire, his niece, Madame Denis, his companion, Père Adam, and his secretaries, Jean-Louis Vanière and Joseph-Marie Duret de Morson, became caught up in the intrigues of the publishers. Ferney was a factory for churning out diabolical bestsellers, but its machinery required lubrication and careful maintenance. While the master-produced copy, the staff handled relations with various sectors of the book trade. In the case of the Question, Voltaire had agreed to add some corrections and additions to Kramer's proofs, and then to look the other way while his secretaries forwarded the corrected proofs to Neuchâtel. But Oosterwal could not resist the temptation to reveal this arrangement while marketing his edition. He boasted openly about it in a circular letter that he mailed to his favorite customers in September 1770. The news spread rapidly through the grapevine of the book trade and soon reached Kramer in Geneva. He complained to Voltaire. Voltaire disavowed all of it, all complicity with Neuchâtel, and the flow of copy suddenly stopped. In consternation, Oosterwal fired off letter after letter to Ferney, first to Voltaire, who did not reply, then to Vanière, who agreed to continue his services as a middleman in return for a dozen free sets of the Question, then to Duret de Morson, who was willingly functioned as a kind of domestic spy, and to Madame Denis, who liked the Neuchâtelois better than the Genevans, but did not dare to lobby aggressively with her uncle. Although Voltaire knew full well about the machinations all around him, he pretended to ignore them while pursuing interests of his own. He wanted better service from Cramer, who had neglected the printing of the Question and had fallen behind in his edition of Voltaire's complete works in order to concentrate on a new edition of the Encyclopédie. Voltaire was a hard taskmaster when it came to typography. He pummeled Cramer with complaints about the foreman of his printing shop, Le Gros Suisse, as he called him, and found so many errors in the first 3 volumes of the Question that he wrote, quote, "New edition carefully purged of the typographical mistakes that abound throughout the others," end quote, at the top of the proof of volume 4, and then permitted Vanière to send it to Neuchâtel. The SDN therefore resumed its printing and did its best to cope with the complaints that it received from Gosse, whose letters contained nothing but lamentations about delays, poor sales, and even the text itself. Because in spite of Osterwald's assurances, he found no important differences between the Neuchâtel and the Genevan editions. When the copy for volume 8 arrived, Osterwald assured him that they had almost reached the end and bragged about a manuscript note to the article on superstition that did not exist in Cramer's text. Gosse was not impressed. Quote, "We are distressed to learn that Monsieur de Voltaire did not complete the questions at volume 8 and that there will be a 9th volume. This book is becoming a burden, and up to now, messieurs, it is selling very badly because we still have more than 450 copies in our warehouse," end quote. The sour tone that now prevailed in Gosse's correspondence did not, in fact, result from the sales of the Question. He had become disgusted with the book trade in general, and in May 1772, he announced that he would retire. Quote, "The book trade is in such a sad state, the sale of good works is so miserable that we no longer know what to do. The good books frequently remain in our storerooms, and the paltry ones find customers," end quote. Now, the Question belonged, in his estimation, to the category of the good, but it was not the bestseller he had expected. Quote, "This work, even though it is by the great Voltaire, hardly sells at all," he concluded in one of his last letters to the STN. He closed his account and turned his business over to his son, Pierre Frédéric, in December 1773. But no bookseller commanded a perfect view of the literary marketplace. Although Gosse knew it as well as anyone, his judgment seemed to have clouded over in his old age. His son threw himself into the business with fresh energy and optimism. Pierre Frédéric soon sold off all their copies of the Question and ordered more, 6 in February 1775, 6 in March, and 30 in May. So the demand had not dried up, despite the jeremiads of Gosse père, and the general trade in pirated works continued to flourish, as one can see by consulting the letters of other Swiss publishers. Time to conclude. Pirate publishing is a subject that has not been adequately explored, but by studying it from the inside, through the correspondence of the publishers themselves, one can see how it actually operated in the 18th century. The pirates were businessmen, not buccaneers. They did business outside the law, but usually the law of another country, not their own. No copyright agreement existed beyond national boundaries. The very concept of copyright had not yet displaced the older idea of privilege, except in Britain, and even there, as you probably know, it was disputed throughout the 18th century until a famous decision in 1774. In France, privilege combined with censorship and the monopoly of the Parisian Booksellers Guild to create a peculiar marketplace for literature was what determined the basic conditions. The pirates supplied the market not by conforming to the rules of the game laid down in royal edicts, but rather by satisfying demand wherever, whatever it was. They did so systematically by calculating risks, costs, and profits, and by developing their own variety of market research. Piracy was a science, an imperfect science, to be sure, but by applying it, the pirates provided the bulk of the books that were sold in France on the eve of the Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Darnton, for that stimulating and revealing talk. And we have no doubt a million questions. We're a bit late. I don't know if we have time for any questions. Yes, we do. Are you up for questions, Dr.? Oh, wonderful. Okay. We ask that you speak into the microphones, please.
Le hasard fait que je viens de lire votre livre sur la censure, où il y a beaucoup question de négociation aussi entre les auteurs, les instances sensoriales. Ce que vous venez de démontrer, c'est que c'est aussi le cas du marché du livre. Est-ce que vous iriez jusqu'à étendre ce concept de négociation au-delà de l'univers du livre par rapport aux pouvoirs qui sont les pouvoirs établis, les pouvoirs royaux, etc.?
Oui, tout à fait. Je vois de la négociation partout. Et dans mon livre, comme vous savez, donc j'ai comparé trois systèmes plus ou moins autoritaires. La France du XVIIIe siècle, l'Inde britannique du XIXe et l'Allemagne communiste du XXe siècle. Donc, chaque système est complètement différent des autres, mais on trouve partout de la négociation. Les censeurs étaient complices avec les auteurs, ça dépendait, n'est-ce pas? Et il y avait des moments très stalinistes dans le fonctionnement du système en Allemagne de l'Est, mais je vois presque chaque système politique, aussi arbitraire et autoritaire qu'il soit, comme un système qui demande des négociations, de la complicité, non seulement de la part des auteurs et des censeurs, mais des rédacteurs de revues, des chefs des maisons de publication, un peu partout.
Just two short questions. Thank you for a great talk. Did the STN publish an edition of the Encyclopédie or other heavily subscribed works? And also, when was the deficiency in copyright finally rectified in France? Was it the Napoleonic Code or?
No, before that. It took a revolution, but by 1794, you've got the modern notion of copyright. And you move into a new world in which the author, Foucault would say, the author function has taken over, that authors are identified with their works, that you get biographies of writers, you get the sacre de l'écrivain, and many other things that together make up I would say, a new world of publishing in the book trade that really takes shape, moves into high gear in the 19th century, especially with now the development of a mass readership, steam-powered presses, and cheap paper made from wood pulp. So I see the 19th century as fundamentally different from the 18th in all those respects. And for my part, I don't accept the notion of a reading revolution, which has been developed by some German scholars. There's something to it, but the real revolution in my eyes takes place in the 19th century. Now, did I ever write about the encyclopédie? Well, yes. I wrote a book that's much too long, about 700 pages on the printing history of the encyclopédie. But its ambition is, again, to get inside the workings of the publishing system and to show how it operated. So the STN actually did print a lot of the quarto edition of the encyclopédie, but it did it as part of an international consortium. The most important person in the consortium, in a way, was Charles-Joseph Panckoucke, a very powerful publisher in Paris. But the key person was a rather obscure bookseller in Lyon called Joseph Duplain. And he began by pirating. So Panckoucke had what he called the rights to the encyclopédie. It's a book whose privilege had been taken away by the king, and yet there were rights to it. What were these rights? Actually, they were connected with the plates for illustrations, which were very valuable. So Panckoucke had the plates, but Joseph Duplain decided that he would just pirate the last edition, which was a folio edition, and have only 4 volumes of plates, no more luxe typographique, you see, but he would have 4 instead of 10, and he would reduce the price spectacularly. Well, this took off, and the STN, as well as Panckoucke and Duplain, and a very important bookseller called Clément Planteur in Liège, they all put their money in it together, they marketed it together, and they concluded this was the biggest success, commercial success, in the entire history of publishing up to then. So the encyclopédie did reach a very broad public in France as well as other countries, but it did so according to this wheeling and dealing and so on at the heart of the industry.
Thank you.
I see my colleague from the McGill University Archives has a question.
It's an archives question.
Oh.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I was really struck by the value of archival records to your research and the rarity of records from publishing houses. How did the records of the STN survive?
Good luck. And the fact that Neuchâtel, I don't know if any of you have been there, I mean, it's a lovely little city on its own lake across the Jura Mountains from France, so it's well placed to provide books to the French market, but it does have some mountains between it and the French squads of invading police. And it didn't have wars. I mean, there was a revolution of sorts in 1848, but no one bombed Neuchâtel. It's still a lovely city with lots of buildings from the 16th century and even earlier, and magnificent buildings from the 18th century where Rousseau went. And they knew Rousseau, they knew Voltaire. I mean, this is a small world, but it's a world that remained intact. And so there were 3 main directors of the STN. And one of them, the family of Bosset de Luz, owned a lovely chateau overlooking the lake. And when the STN was it had business troubles in 1783, but the French Revolution ended it all because you got a free trade in books. So it went out of business. But it had all of these archives, and instead of throwing them into the lake, or just getting rid of them, as all other publishing houses did. There's some from the Société Typographique de Bouillon. There's a Grand Livre of Gabriel Cramer, but it has no titles of books in it. So all of these archives were put in the attic of this splendid chateau, and they sat there until a retired chemist began putting them in order as a sort of hobby, and they wound up in the municipal library of Neuchâtel, where I consulted them for the first time in 1965. So I've been going there ever since because they're endlessly fascinating, and they reveal a great deal about not only writers like Voltaire, but how the system really operated.
Well, thank you so much again. And as an homage to circularity, we will end where we began, with some closing remarks from Dr. Richard Ver.
Thank you, and I particularly want to thank Robert Darnton for his most engaging and interesting paper. For someone who finds themselves more and more involved in the mysteries of publishing history, not quite in the 18th century, but in the early 19th century, and the intractable materials that one has to work with. It's very gratifying to see that something could actually be made out of it. I had little idea that this morning when I spoke about visiting Voltaire, that we would in fact visit Voltaire in so many different ways today. And I very much want to thank all our speakers for their contribution to this most, I think, from my point of view at least, most satisfying and engaging day. I have been working on this program, I think, for the past 18 months. So I'm very glad to see that it's come to this fruition. I also want to thank people who have worked behind the scenes, particularly the staff of the Trenholm Dean of Libraries office. We could not have done this without their cooperation and help and support in so many ways. And finally, I would like to thank our moderator today, Chris Lyons, who's done a marvelous job, but then I would only expect that. From one of my students. So, and finally, just thank you, all of you, for your attendance. It has been a great privilege to have you here at McGill. And now I would invite you to join us in a glass of wine as we continue our conversations and discussions. Bonne soirée et merci beaucoup.